Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Dr. Vanessa Milagros, and today we're going to be talking about 9 signs of emotional neglect. We're going to run through what emotional neglect is, the difference between intentional and unintentional emotional neglect, and then we're going to look at the 9 signs of emotional neglect in adulthood. So emotional neglect in childhood is defined as not having the important elements that are necessary for healthy development of a child. So those specific elements include things such as support, care, attention, nurturing, connection, adequately responding during times of the child experiencing stress or learning about the world and their place within it. And sometimes emotional neglect tends to be more covert than other types of abuse. And this is because it can go under the radar of things that we don't learn as parents, but then also things that we find it difficult to give. But we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. It's important to note that emotional neglect does not happen from occasionally not hearing your child or not being completely attentive all of the time to your child. Emotional neglect is an ongoing pattern of failing to meet a child's needs for connection and support in emotional ways. An example of this would be a parent who consistently dismisses their child's big emotions, such as anger, stress, crying, even demeaning a child for the emotions that they experience. And these actions over time cause a child to understand to the best of their abilities that those emotions are not important. And so they find ways to suppress them. Now let's talk about the difference between intentional and unintentional emotional neglect. And I really want to emphasize this point because I think it's important to understand that we can hear the definition for emotional neglect and think, oh my gosh, have I done this? And there's a clear difference. It is the consistent, it's a pattern of continuously ignoring your child's bids for connection or your child's need for support from you. So an example of unintentional emotional neglect, which still has the same damaging effects. However, the difference here is unintentional emotional neglect can come from situations where families have to work 2 or 3 jobs in order to maintain the stability of the household, where there's mental illness involved, when the parent is actively experiencing their own abuse, immigration, incarceration, loss of loved ones, poverty, work pressures. There's so many outside factors that we have to bring into the equation. Therefore, the difference between unintentional and intentional emotional neglect is that the intentional emotional neglect is purposeful. So it may not be an active decision. It's more so I don't like these big feelings and emotions that are coming up. It's bringing up my own situation and memories and traumas and triggers as a parent. And so I am actively choosing to not partake in that. And that's where the intentional emotional neglect can come from. And although we can understand part of the reasons why parents can emotionally neglect their children, it still has the same damaging impacts for their children in the future. And so bringing awareness to the differences is not an excuse. It's an explanation, an understanding. Now let's go through 9 signs that you have experienced emotional neglect. Number 1, frequent sense of numbness or emptiness. You may notice a empty sensation within your throat, your stomach, physically. It just doesn't feel like anything. So instead of feeling emotions, it feels more like a void internally. And part of the reason for this is due to having your emotions, your feelings ignored or unacknowledged growing up. And as developing young adults, it's very important for us to understand how to understand our emotions, regulate our emotions, work through conflict. And so if we miss out on part or all of those very important things, then we create core beliefs that tell us that our emotions are not good, that our emotions are way out of proportion to what you actually should be feeling because nobody else is feeling this around you, or so you think. And so you attribute any emotions to being bad. Another thing that happens that we'll talk about a little bit later more is that you also learn how to self-soothe in the ways that you know how. And this may not be necessarily healthy ways, but it's what works for you at the time. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the feeling of numbness can really stem from a disconnect between you and your emotions, which in turn can also impact your ability to create meaningful relationships in the future and even working on your own personal growth. It's not impossible, but it just becomes that much harder. Next, difficulty trusting and relying on others. Individuals who have experienced emotional neglect are self-sufficient to the core. They've had to be. And so having to depend on somebody else or even ask for help, that's foreign territory. We don't do that over here. right? And so if you have a need, you meet that need. And the fear behind this is that if you ask for help and you get rejected or you don't get your needs met that you've asked for, then you go back to feeling immensely rejected, unimportant, your feelings, you don't matter. It goes very deep rooted. And so to not even start to go down that road, it's just easier, quotes here, for someone who has experienced emotional neglect to not even ask for help. That doesn't even cross their mind. And so there are some instances where individuals who experience emotional neglect will say, well, I didn't even think asking for help was an option. That's how deep rooted it can be at times. And there are people who are healthy and are willing to help you, maybe friends, coworkers, extended family. There are people out there who are willing to do so. But for you, if you experience emotional neglect to a certain extent, it doesn't seem that way. That's not the worldview that you have. Next, difficulty expressing and processing your emotions. When you learn to detach from your emotions because you realize, hey, these emotions are bad. I don't get my needs met when I have these emotions. Therefore, they're not good. Remember, as children and young adults, we learn and understand about our world and how to interact with it from seeing others, our own personal experiences. So it doesn't take much for us to understand the pattern that if I cry as a child because I'm hungry or I'm tired and my needs are not met, eventually I learn that that is not the way to get my needs met. And so you either compensate by doing it yourself or you go without. Let's take it a step further in life. As a young adult to an adult, you understand that emotions are not good. They're bad. And so you learn to detach from your emotions. If you detach from your emotions long enough, then it's difficult for you to understand what are these emotions that are coming up for me now? And how do I even begin to process this? There's a clear, distinct separation between the two, specifically when we're talking about big emotions or big feelings, because we all experience emotions and they come up whenever they come up. However, if we struggle with understanding how to deal with them or understand them or name them, let alone process them, it's easier in the moment to detach. And then that's where the numbness that I mentioned earlier and the feelings of void and emptiness come into play. Next is a sensitivity to rejection. And this is a big one because for those who've experienced emotional neglect, rejection can seem like an abandonment. Because remember, there's already a difficulty in asking for help, if that even comes up for someone who's experienced emotional neglect. Therefore, if you even take the next step in asking for help and you get rejected, that doesn't appear like a rejection as we would normally understand that life happens. And there are things that you're going to get a no from, you're going to get rejected from. We understand when we have a healthy viewpoint of things that rejection happens. It hurts, but there's an understanding that it's going to happen. For those who've experienced severe emotional neglect, they don't even want to go there. It's deeper than that. It's almost the same intense feelings as being rejected by their caregivers while growing up. It can be that intense. And you may look at it from the outside looking in and think, that doesn't make much sense. It's normal to maybe get rejected from a job or a school or not have your needs met when you ask for it. For someone who's experienced severe emotional neglect, it's not that simple. It's much more deep rooted. And so all of these, again, big feelings are coming up in the moments where they feel rejected, AKA abandoned. It's too much to handle. So we're not even going to go there. Feeling different from others. Some people who've experienced emotional neglect reported feeling off or different from other people and not being able to explain or express that. So maybe you've thought that something has been wrong with you or you felt off, specifically when you're in social gatherings or social interaction. And this is a normal symptom as your sense of self and relationships are impacted. Detachment from your own feelings and the feelings and emotions of others. It's very difficult to understand your own emotions, let alone somebody else's emotions. It can seem very insensitive to others at times, and they have a difficulty showing compassion to others. So maybe those people who tell it like it is, and I'm just going to give it to you straight, and that's it. Although it may seem and come across as insensitive, it's important to understand that there is a deep disconnect within vulnerability, because vulnerability means I have to ask something of you. I have to show you a part of myself that not everybody else sees. And if I don't do that within myself, for myself, how could I possibly let somebody else see that side of me? I don't even understand it. And so although it may come across as insensitive and it may be lacking compassion and lacking sensitivity, it is rooted in the disconnect between them and their understanding of emotions. And it is also a protective barrier. Because if I learn how to be attuned and sensitive to your needs emotionally, that means that on some level, I've learned how to do the same for myself. If not, then practicing being sensitive and showing compassion to others may feel very robotic for you, something that doesn't come naturally. You almost feel really like off or yucky or weird about it when you do show compassion or sensitivity to someone else's emotions. This can also look like lacking patience and not forgiving others or even practicing self-forgiveness. Next, you may find it difficult to discern what people expect from you on an emotional level when it comes to relationships or friendships. And you may also find it difficult to understand why people do some of the things that they do. Next, you may be an expert at self-soothing yourself, not others. So for instance, let's go back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier, which is when a child grows up in an emotional, neglectful environment, or when an adult or a young adult gets into a relationship with individuals who are emotionally neglectful, because it doesn't just have to be from caregivers. In those moments and instances, the individual learns how to self-soothe. They have to. They have no other choice. Now, self-soothing looks different, and this is what we were talking about earlier in the video. Self-soothing is usually in unhealthy ways. Not always, but most of the time it is. I want you to think about it this way. If you did not learn how to understand your emotions, and therefore did not understand how to process them, and viewed emotions as inherently bad or not good, then after that, what are you left with? You've got to figure it out. And so figuring it out without a healthy example of what to do or guidance, you're left to your own devices. And sometimes that means unhealthy coping skills such as substance use, gaming, social media, distractions, not being present within the moment, isolation. It tends to work because, again, it's a form of detachment from the strong emotions, from the big emotions, and it works, or so it seems. So you learn to become an expert at self-soothing yourself, usually in mostly unhealthy ways that continuously distract you and distance you from any emotional understanding or processing. And last, protecting your time alone, fiercely protecting this time. So when you have not only the physical isolation, but the emotional isolation, right? Because we understand that emotional neglect can go hand in hand with physical neglect. So for instance, a child can be, and I'm just using the example of a caregiver, but let's use that. A child can be in the home with a parent. And so you'd think, oh, physically they're here. Sure. However, are they in the other room? Are they not paying attention to the child? Does the child still have to fend for themselves in the home, cook, clean, do everything for everybody else at an age where it should be expected that some things they do on their own, but other things they don't? And that in those instances, the caregivers are involved because they may be in the same location. However, the child is doing everything for the child, or sometimes the child is doing everything for the child and their siblings. So sometimes they go hand in hand. Therefore, the emotional isolation or being alone is something that individuals thrive for as they become young adults or adults. And you may actually feel stress when you are in social settings. You may fiercely protect your alone time because this is where I feel safest. I don't hurt anybody's feelings here. I don't do the wrong thing when I'm alone. I am alone. This is safe. I can't make any mistakes here. This is me. And you protect that time. Why? Because you feel safest when you're alone. Emotional neglect is one of those topics that it's difficult to understand and it's difficult to recognize that we might have experienced this ourselves. However, I want you to work on taking an honest look, if you're ready, on if this has happened to you and if you've also done these behaviors to others. If we acknowledge these things, then we can start the healing process. Remember to work with a therapist or a mentor or someone who can help you be a neutral party and help you work through understanding what emotional neglect is on a deeper level or on a personal level for you, and then working on ways to actually heal and work through that so that you don't then impact somebody else like that or in similar forms. Remember, hurt people hurt people. There's always a choice to heal if you choose it. There are support systems out there. You just have to reach out. Thank you so much for being here. If you have any video requests, please let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video or learned something from it, make sure to subscribe. Also, check out this video next. I'll see you in the next one.